You, she said, her voice cutting through the polite chatter like a blade. The janitor who's always watching. Come here and play something for us. The room fell silent. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone suppressed a laugh. Daniel stood frozen near the doorway, mop bucket still visible in the hallway behind him. His worn uniform a stark contrast to the silk and diamonds that filled the room. The lights in the mansion's grand music room were impossibly bright that evening, and every eye in the room turned to stare at Daniel as Victoria Whitmore, daughter of the estate's billionaire owner, raised her delicate hand and pointed directly at him. What happened next would change everything. Daniel Torres had worked at the Whitmore estate for 3 years. Every weekday evening, around 7 o'clock, he would begin his cleaning rotation through the mansion's east wing. The music room was always last, not because it was the largest or the dirtiest, but because that was when Victoria practiced. He would move slowly through his work, methodical and quiet, as the sound of Chopin or Rachmaninoff filled the vaulted space. He never spoke to her, never interrupted. He simply cleaned and listened. And sometimes when she left the room, his eyes would linger on the Steinway grand piano that sat in the center like a black monument. The other staff had noticed, of course. In a house that size, nothing went unseen. Maria, the head housekeeper, had teased him about it over coffee one morning. "You watch her like she's playing a symphony just for you," she'd said, not unkindly. But Carlos, one of the groundskeepers, had been less gentle. "Man, you think you're invisible or something? Everyone sees you staring. It's weird." Daniel had only shrugged, offering no explanation, no defense. What could he say that wouldn't sound foolish? The guests had noticed too, during the parties and gatherings that punctuated the Whitmore family's social calendar. They'd seen him hovering near the music room, pretending to polish the same section of marble floor twice, 3 times. A few had made comments within his earshot. "Does the help usually linger like that?" one woman had asked. "Perhaps he's just never heard real music before," another had replied, her tone dripping with condescension. Daniel had absorbed these remarks the way he absorbed everything else in that house, silently without reaction, his expression carefully neutral. But Victoria had noticed most of all. She'd grown up in that mansion, surrounded by staff who moved like ghosts through her life, present but invisible, necessary but forgettable. Daniel's presence was different. There was something in the way he stood, something in his stillness that irritated her. Or perhaps it was the way he looked at her playing, not with the vacant politeness of hired help, but with something that looked almost like recognition, like understanding. She didn't like it. It made her feel exposed in a way she couldn't articulate. So when her 25th birthday gala was being planned, and her father had insisted she perform for the 150 guests they'd invited, an idea had formed in her mind, a small, cruel idea that felt like justice for some unnamed transgression. She would invite the janitor to play. She would expose whatever fantasy he'd constructed in his head during those evenings of watching her. She would show him, and everyone else, the gulf that existed between observation and ability, between appreciation and talent. The planning for the gala had taken months. Victoria's mother, Catherine, had hired event coordinators from New York, a catering company that specialized in high society functions, and a florist who'd once arranged flowers for a royal wedding. The guest list included business associates of her father's, donors to various charitable foundations the family supported, and members of the social circle her mother had cultivated over decades. These were people accustomed to perfection, to experiences curated and polished until every rough edge had been smoothed away. Victoria had spent weeks preparing her performance. She'd chosen Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, a piece that was technically challenging and visually impressive. Her instructor, Professor Levinson from Juilliard, had flown in twice to work with her on specific passages. "You're playing it correctly," he'd told her during their last session, "but you're not yet playing it convincingly. There's a difference between executing notes and making music breathe." Victoria had nodded, practiced harder, but the distinction he was making remained elusive to her. Daniel had watched some of those practice sessions. He'd seen her frustration when a particular run didn't flow smoothly, seen her attack the same measures over and over until they were technically perfect, but somehow lifeless. He'd wanted to say something, to offer some insight, but what right did he have? He was the janitor. His job was to clean, not to critique. The night of the gala arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. The mansion's gardens had been lit with thousands of tiny white lights, creating the illusion of stars brought down to earth. Guests arrived in luxury vehicles that lined the circular driveway, their jewelry catching the light as they made their way inside. Daniel had been scheduled to work that evening, not because his regular duties required it, but because Maria had called in sick with what sounded like a severe case of the flu. "I'm so sorry to ask," the event coordinator had said when she'd called him that afternoon. "I know it's your day off, but we need someone who knows the house, just to keep the music room pristine and handle any unexpected issues. Extra pay, of course." Daniel had agreed because he always agreed, and because the extra money would help with Sophia's upcoming school trip to Washington, D.C. He'd arrived early, dressed in his usual work uniform, and had been briefed on his responsibilities. Stay discreet. Keep the music room immaculate. Be ready to address any problems quickly and invisibly. The same expectations that governed his presence in the house every other day. If you enjoy stories where truth eventually rises, consider subscribing. What Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Daniel Torres had once been someone else entirely. 15 years earlier, he'd been Daniel Torres Martinez, a name that appeared on concert programs in Mexico City, São Paulo, and Madrid. He'd studied at the National Conservatory of Music under Maestro Hidalgo, a legendary figure in Latin American classical music. At 19, Daniel had won the national piano competition, performing Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto with an intensity that the judges described as both technically flawless and emotionally devastating. His career had risen quickly. By 23, he'd performed with the Symphonic Orchestra of Mexico, the São Paulo Symphony, and had been invited to participate in the International Chopin Piano Competition in Warsaw. Critics called him promising. Some called him brilliant. One reviewer in Madrid had written, "Torres Martinez plays with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a poet, though one senses he is still searching for the life experience that will fully unlock his artistry." That life experience came in the form of his daughter's illness. Sophia had been 11 months old when the diagnosis arrived, like a bomb detonating in the center of their lives: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors had explained it in careful, measured terms, but what Daniel heard was years of treatment, an uncertain prognosis, and intensive care. His wife, Elena, had been 8 months into her pediatric residency at the time, her schedule already brutal and inflexible. They'd sat in their small apartment that night, Sophia sleeping in the next room, and done calculations that had nothing to do with music. Elena's residency required 80-hour weeks. Someone needed to be available for Sophia's appointments, for the days when her fever spiked or her blood counts dropped, or the chemotherapy left her too weak to lift her head. Someone needed to have a flexible schedule, to be able to leave work at a moment's notice when the hospital called. Daniel had withdrawn from the Warsaw competition first, then from his contract with a recording label that had wanted to produce his debut album, then from his teaching position at the conservatory. The money from his performances was good when it came, but irregular. They needed steady income, health insurance, the kind of financial stability that didn't depend on concert bookings months in advance. Elena had connections at a research hospital in Houston, one of the best pediatric cancer centers in the country. They'd offered her a position. It meant leaving Mexico, leaving their families, leaving the entire support system they'd built. But it also meant access to cutting-edge treatments, to specialists, to hope. They'd moved within 6 weeks. In Houston, Daniel had discovered that his conservatory credentials meant little in the job market. He spoke English well enough, but he had no American work history, no local references, no network. He'd taken the first job he could find that offered health insurance and schedule flexibility: janitorial work at a hospital, then at an office building, then through a connection Elena had made at the Whitmore estate. The work was simple, mindless, beneath his education and training. But it allowed him to leave at noon for Sophia's appointments. It allowed him to take emergency days without losing his position. It allowed him to be the parent their daughter needed while Elena pursued the medical career that would eventually provide them with security and stability. He'd stopped playing piano gradually, not through any conscious decision, but through the slow accumulation of exhaustion and necessity. His hands still worked, his fingers still remembered, but the part of him that had needed to perform, that had found identity and purpose in music, had gone dormant, or so he told himself. Sophia's treatment had lasted 4 years. 4 years of chemotherapy and radiation, of hospital stays and setbacks and small victories. 4 years of watching his daughter fight for her life, while he mopped floors and emptied trash cans and pretended that the person he'd been before didn't exist. She'd entered remission at age 5, then relapsed at 6, then finally achieved stable remission at 7. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. 5 years without relapse would mean they could consider her cured. They were past that milestone now. Sophia was 14, healthy, thriving in school, complaining about homework and begging to go to concerts with her friends. Elena was an attending physician, respected in her field, earning enough that Daniel could have stopped working the janitorial jobs. But something had calcified in him during those years. The idea of returning to music felt like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit, like pretending he was still the person who'd walked away from the Warsaw competition without regret. He'd kept his past private, not out of shame, but out of practicality. What would be the point of telling his coworkers that he'd once performed for thousands, that critics had once praised his interpretations? It would only create distance, awkwardness, questions he didn't want to answer. Better to be Daniel the janitor, reliable and invisible, than Daniel the failed pianist working below his potential. But the music room called to him every evening. When Victoria practiced, Daniel would find reasons to work slowly, to extend his time in that space. He'd listen to her play Chopin and hear all the places where the emotion should crescendo, but didn't. He'd hear her execute Beethoven with technical precision, but without the rage that made Beethoven matter. He'd want to stop her, to sit down and show her how a single phrase could transform a piece from competent to transcendent. But he never did. It wasn't his place. Victoria had noticed his attention, and she'd interpreted it as something between presumption and delusion. She'd mentioned it to her father once. "The janitor, Daniel, he watches me practice. It's odd." Richard Whitmore had barely looked up from his papers. "If it bothers you, I'll speak to the service company." But Victoria had said no, not wanting to seem petty. Instead, she'd simply resented Daniel's presence. This reminder that even her private moments of practice were performed before an audience of staff. The idea to humiliate him had come to her during a conversation with her friend Marissa, another young woman from their social circle. They'd been discussing the gala, and Marissa had mentioned how boring these performances usually were. "Everyone's too polite to tell you if you're awful," Marissa had said, laughing. "You could probably get the waitstaff to perform, and no one would complain." The comment had lodged in Victoria's mind. What if she did exactly that? What if she invited the janitor to play, exposed whatever fantasy he'd constructed, and demonstrated to him and everyone else the difference between watching music and making it? It would be a lesson, she'd told herself, not cruelty, a necessary correction to his presumption. She'd run the idea past a few trusted friends. Some had been horrified. "That's mean, Victoria." Others had found it hilarious. "Oh my God, can you imagine?" Victoria herself had wavered, but the more she thought about Daniel's steady presence during her practices, the more the plan felt justified. He needed to understand his place. They all did. The evening of the gala unfolded exactly as planned until the moment Victoria pointed at Daniel. The guests had arrived, champagne had been served, her father had given his speech about how proud he was of his daughter's accomplishments. Victoria had performed her prepared piece competently, earning enthusiastic applause. And then, in a moment that felt both spontaneous and perfectly calculated, she'd scanned the room and spotted Daniel standing near the doorway. The silence that followed her words was thick with anticipation. Daniel felt every gaze in the room shift to him. He saw Richard Whitmore's face tighten with confusion, and something that might have been concern. He saw Catherine Whitmore's hand move to her throat, a gesture of social anxiety. He saw some of the other staff members look away, embarrassed on his behalf. He saw dozens of guests smile in anticipation of entertainment, pulling out their phones to record whatever was about to happen. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore," Daniel said quietly. his voice steady despite the situation. "But I'm working." "It's my birthday," Victoria replied, her tone light but her eyes hard. "Surely you can spare a few minutes. You spend so much time in this room anyway. I thought perhaps you'd like to try." She smiled at her guests, inviting them to share in the joke. "It's only fair, don't you think? He's had a free education watching me practice all these months." A few guests laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of nervous amusement that comes from witnessing a social boundary being crossed. Daniel understood what was happening. He understood that refusing would create a scene, would mark him as difficult, would potentially cost him his job. He understood that Victoria had engineered this moment specifically to put him in an impossible position. He also understood that she had no idea what she was actually asking for. Daniel moved toward the piano slowly, aware of his uniform, aware of his hands that still smelled faintly of cleaning solution, despite the gloves he'd worn. He was aware of the collective judgment in the room, the assumptions being made about him, about his capabilities, about his place in the world. He sat at the bench and looked at the keys for a long moment. They were beautiful keys, ivory and ebony, perfectly maintained. He'd watched Victoria play them 1,000 times. "What should I play?" he asked, looking up at her. "Whatever you'd like," Victoria said generously, as though granting permission to a child. "Surprise us." The worst part wasn't the setup or the public nature of the humiliation. The worst part was seeing how some of the guests had already started whispering, how a few had their phones held up to record what they assumed would be an awkward disaster. The worst part was recognizing that this moment was already being packaged as an anecdote, a story they'd tell at other parties about the time the janitor thought he could play piano at the Whitmore estate. Daniel placed his hands on the keys. He thought about Sophia in her hospital bed, tubes running from her small body to machines that beeped and hummed through the night. He thought about Elena falling asleep in a chair beside her, still in her scrubs, too exhausted to drive home. He thought about the concert in Madrid he'd canceled, the recording contract he'd walked away from, the career he'd set aside without hesitation, because his daughter's life mattered more than any performance ever could. And then he began to play. He chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, not because it was the most difficult piece he knew, but because it was honest. It began quietly, almost tentatively, just 3 low notes repeating like a heartbeat, like a warning, like the sound of a door opening into darkness. The guests stopped talking. The room fell into a different quality of silence. Then the melody emerged from the bass, dark and searching, and Daniel let his fingers remember what they'd once known without thinking. The muscle memory was still there, preserved somehow through years of disuse. But more than that, the emotion was there, deeper and more complex than it had been when he was 23 in performing for critics. Now he played as someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to sacrifice, who had lived enough to make Rachmaninoff's darkness feel earned rather than performed. The dynamics swelled from meditation to something like controlled fury. His left hand drove forward with a relentless bass progression, while his right hand sang the melody that Rachmaninoff had written after dreaming of bells, of warnings, of death approaching on horseback. The piano responded to his touch the way good instruments do, amplifying not just the notes but the intention behind them, the architecture of emotion built into every phrase. Daniel didn't play to impress them. He didn't play to prove anything. He played because it was the only honest thing he could do in that moment, the only response that matched the truth of who he'd been and what he'd become. The music built toward its climax, those crashing chords that felt like something breaking or something being born, like rage and grief and beauty tangled together. His fingers moved across the keys with a certainty that came not from practice, but from understanding, from having lived long enough and lost enough to know what Rachmaninoff was trying to say. When the piece reached its peak, the fortissimo sections where the piano seemed to roar, Daniel felt himself disappearing into the music the way he used to, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in more than a decade. The room around him ceased to exist. Victoria ceased to exist. The guests with their phones and their expectations ceased to exist. There was only the piano and the music, and the conversation he was having with a long-dead Russian composer across more than a century of time. And then it descended back into those same 3 notes at the end. Quiet again. Inevitable. like a question that would never be answered. He played them like a prayer, like a goodbye, like an acknowledgement of something lost and something found. The final note hung in the air for a moment after his hands left the keys. Daniel sat very still, his eyes closed, coming back to himself slowly. The silence was different now, charged, uncertain. No one seemed to know how to react. Then someone started clapping. Not the polite, automatic applause that had followed Victoria's performance, but something slower, more considered, as though the person clapping was trying to process what they just heard. Others joined in, and the sound built until the entire room was filled with it. Some guests were looking at Daniel with expressions of genuine shock. Others were looking at Victoria, then back at Daniel, as though trying to reconcile what they'd assumed with what they'd witnessed. Daniel stood carefully, his face neutral, and turned to face Victoria. She was standing very still, her expression unreadable. Her mother's hand was at her throat again, but this time the gesture seemed less about anxiety and more about genuine surprise. Richard Whitmore was staring at Daniel as though seeing him for the first time, his brow furrowed with something between confusion and interest. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Richard's voice cut through the applause, silencing it. Daniel met his eyes. "Mexico City Conservatory, sir, a long time ago." "You studied at a conservatory." It wasn't quite a question. The words hung in the air, rearranging everyone's understanding of the previous few minutes. "And you're working as a janitor?" "I needed flexible hours," Daniel said simply. "My daughter was sick." For a long time. The room had gone quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet now. Several guests were looking at Victoria, then back at Daniel, as though reassessing what they'd just witnessed. The phones that had been held up to record an embarrassment were being lowered, their owners suddenly uncertain about whether this was a moment they should have captured. One woman, older, with the kind of face that suggested she knew something about music, was studying Daniel with open curiosity. "What's your daughter's name?" Catherine Whitmore asked, her voice gentler than her daughter's had been. "Sophia. She's 14 now. In remission, 6 years." "I'm glad," Catherine said, and she sounded like she meant it. "That must have been terrifying." "It was," Daniel acknowledged. Then, because he could feel the weight of expectation in the room, the sense that everyone wanted him to say more, he added, "If you'll excuse me, I should get back to work." But Richard Whitmore's voice stopped him. "Wait, please. I'd like to speak with you after this evening concludes. Would that be acceptable?" Daniel nodded once, then left the room. He could feel their eyes on his back as he walked away, could hear the immediate explosion of whispered conversation that erupted the moment he crossed the threshold into the hallway. He'd lived long enough to know that what had just happened would be interpreted and reinterpreted, discussed and dissected, that the story would spread through the Whitmore family's social circle with the speed of scandal. In the service corridor, he found Carlos waiting, his eyes wide. "Holy hell, man. I heard everything through the door. You never told us you could play like that." "You never asked," Daniel said, but he said it gently. "Everyone's going to be talking about this." "I know." Carlos shook his head. Victoria looked like she wanted to disappear. "I almost felt bad for her." "Almost." He paused. "You going to take whatever job Whitmore offers you? Because he's definitely going to offer you something. Rich guys like that, they don't like being surprised." "I don't know yet," Daniel said honestly. "I need to think about it." The rest of the evening passed in a strange suspension. Daniel returned to his regular duties, but several times he noticed guests watching him differently, whispering to each other with expressions that suggested they were reevaluating assumptions they hadn't known they'd made. Victoria stayed in the ballroom for the remainder of the party, but she wasn't playing piano anymore. She moved through the crowd with her usual grace, accepting birthday wishes and making small talk, but there was something diminished in her presence, as though the confidence she usually wore like armor had developed a crack. Her father kept glancing toward the hallways, as though tracking Daniel's movements through the house. Catherine Whitmore had found the event coordinator and asked several quiet questions about Daniel's employment history. The guests, sensing drama, lingered longer than they might have otherwise, hoping for some additional development, some confrontation or revelation that would complete the narrative arc of the evening. When the last guest finally left, close to midnight, Richard Whitmore found Daniel in the service kitchen. The older man looked tired, and something about the set of his shoulders suggested he was uncomfortable, perhaps even embarrassed. He closed the door behind him, ensuring privacy. "My daughter tells me you've been working here for 3 years," he began without preamble. "Yes, sir. And in that time, did anyone ever ask about your background, your education?" Daniel considered the question carefully. The application asked for employment history and references. I provided those. No one asked about music. No one asked about Mexico. They asked if I could clean efficiently and arrive on time. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that. "My daughter wanted to humiliate you tonight. I think you understand that." "Yes, sir." "She's not a cruel person." The words came out defensive. A father protecting his child even as he acknowledged her fault. "But she's been sheltered, privileged. She sees people like you as background characters in her life, not as individuals with full histories. People who exist to serve her needs and then disappear when no longer necessary." He paused, his expression pained. "I'm guilty of the same thing. More guilty, perhaps, because I'm older and should know better. I walk past you in this house every day, and I've never once asked who you are beyond your function." Daniel said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like he was seeking either pity or vindication. "Your daughter," Richard continued, "how is she now?" "Really?" "She's well, in remission 6 years. The doctors say if she makes it to 10 years without relapse, they'll consider her cured. She's a normal teenager now." "Worried about grades and friends and whether she'll make the soccer team." "I'm glad." The words sounded genuine. "My company manufactures some of the diagnostic equipment used in pediatric oncology. I've seen from a distance what families go through. The statistics, the survival rates, the costs. I can't imagine living it." "Most people can't," Daniel said, "until they have to." Richard cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the emotion in the conversation. "I'd like to offer you a different position. We have an arts initiative program meant to bring music education to underserved communities. It's part of our corporate foundation, well-funded, with real resources behind it. It needs a director who understands both music and sacrifice, someone who can relate to the families we're trying to serve. The salary would be considerably more than what you're making now. Health insurance, retirement benefits, the kind of position that would allow you to use your actual education." Daniel looked at the man carefully. "That's generous, but I'm not interested in charity that comes from embarrassment." "It's not charity. It's recognition of a resource I was too blind to see. Though you're right that tonight embarrassed me. It should have." Richard pulled a card from his pocket, held it out. "Think about it. Call me if you're interested. Or don't. Either way, what happened tonight stays between these walls. No one here will speak of it disrespectfully. I'll make sure of that. And if you'd prefer to continue in your current position, that's fine too. There will be no retaliation, no gossip, no change in how you're treated. You have my word." After Richard left, Daniel stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, the business card heavy in his hand. His phone buzzed. A text from Elena. "Sophia wants to know if you'll help her practice tomorrow. She's getting frustrated with the Clementi piece." He smiled at that, at the ordinary frustration of a healthy teenager struggling with something difficult but not impossible. He thought about the job offer. It was tempting. He wouldn't lie to himself about that. It represented a return to music, a use of his training, a salary that would make their lives considerably easier. But it also felt complicated, tangled up in tonight's strange reversal, in Victoria's humiliation and Richard's embarrassment. He'd need to think about it carefully, talk to Elena, maybe even talk to Sophia. This wasn't just his decision anymore. The next morning, Daniel came to work as usual. He'd debated calling in sick, giving everyone a day to process what had happened, but that felt like hiding. Better to face whatever came directly, to maintain his normal routine until he decided otherwise. Victoria was in the music room when he arrived to clean. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, the words clearly difficult for her. "What I did last night was cruel. I thought I was exposing some delusion of yours, some fantasy you'd constructed about being able to play. But the only thing I exposed was my own arrogance and ignorance. Daniel set down his supply caddy. Why did it bother you so much? That I listened when you played? She considered the question, and he could see her struggling toward honesty. I think because you look like you understood something I don't. Like you could hear what was missing in my playing, the gap between technical skill and real artistry. And that made me feel like a fraud. Like you knew I was just going through motions, executing music rather than feeling it. You're not a fraud. You're skilled, disciplined. Those are real achievements. But not passionate, not like you. She gestured toward the piano. I've had every advantage. The best teachers, unlimited time to practice, no pressure to do anything except perfect my technique. My parents paid for everything, supported every interest. And I play like someone checking off boxes on a list. You've been away from music for years, working a job that has nothing to do with what you train for. And when you play, it sounds like you're bleeding through the keys, like the music is costing you something just to perform it. That's not a compliment to either of us, Daniel said quietly. You play like someone who's never had to choose between music and something more important. I play like someone who remembers what it cost to walk away. Neither of those is wrong. They're just different paths shaped by different necessities. Victoria absorbed that, her expression thoughtful. My father offered you a job. He did. Are you going to take it? I don't know yet, she nodded. For what it's worth, I think you should. I think you could do a lot of good with it. And I think you've already sacrificed enough. Maybe it's time to reclaim something of what you gave up. Over the next several days, the story of what had happened at Victoria's birthday spread through the Whitmore family social circle with predictable speed. Most of the versions Daniel heard about secondhand were fairly accurate, though some had been embellished with details that hadn't actually occurred. What remained consistent across all the retellings was the shock people felt, the realization that they'd been making assumptions about someone they saw regularly but had never really looked at. A few of the guests reached out to Richard Whitmore directly, expressing admiration for Daniel's playing and curiosity about his background. One woman, the older one who'd been studying him with interest during the performance, turned out to be a retired music professor from Rice University. She'd recognized the quality of his playing immediately, the kind of training and natural talent that couldn't be faked. She'd offered to write a recommendation if Daniel decided to pursue anything in music education. Daniel thought about that over the next several days as he continued his regular work. He talked with Elena, who pointed out that Sophia was old enough now that she didn't need the same constant availability she'd required as a sick child. You gave up music for her, Elena said gently. She would never want you to stay away from it on her account. Not anymore. He talked with Sophia herself, who'd listened to his explanation of what had happened, and then said, with teenage directness, Dad, if you want to do music again, you should do music again. I don't want to be the reason you don't. That would make me feel terrible. He thought about the years he'd spent in that mansion, moving through rooms where people didn't see him, listening to someone else play the instrument he'd once loved. He thought about sacrifice and what it meant to reclaim something you'd set aside without bitterness, without regret, but also without pretending the loss hadn't been real. 3 weeks after Victoria's birthday, Daniel called Richard Whitmore's number. They met for coffee at a neutral location, not the estate. They talked about the Arts Initiative program, about its goals and funding, and the communities it hoped to serve. They talked about what Daniel would bring to it, not just musical expertise, but an understanding of what it meant to choose survival over art, and how that choice wasn't a failure, but a different kind of courage. Daniel took the job. He gave his notice to the cleaning company with gratitude for the years of stable employment they'd provided when he'd needed it most. On his last day at the estate, he stopped by the music room one final time. The Steinway sat in its usual place, black and perfect under the chandelier light. He didn't play it. He didn't need to anymore. The Arts Initiative program thrived under his direction. He built partnerships with schools in underserved neighborhoods, brought in teachers who understood that talent existed everywhere, but opportunity didn't. He arranged performances and workshops, created scholarship programs, helped kids who reminded him of his younger self find paths into music that didn't require wealthy parents or social connections. He worked with families facing the same kind of crises his family had faced. parents trying to nurture their children's talents while managing illness or poverty or circumstances that made art seem like an impossible luxury. He helped them navigate those tensions, find flexible paths, hold on to their art even when life demanded difficult choices. He told them his story, not as inspiration, but as evidence that sacrifice didn't have to be permanent, that the things you set aside could be found again in different forms. Victoria continued her own musical education, but she changed teachers, found someone who pushed her to play with more emotional risk, to let herself be vulnerable in her performances rather than hiding behind technical perfection. She came to one of the program's concerts 6 months after Daniel started, sat in the audience, and watched him introduce a 15-year-old pianist who played with raw, unpolished brilliance. The girl had grown up in public housing, had learned piano on a donated keyboard in her apartment, had never had a formal lesson until Daniel's program found her. Afterward, Victoria congratulated him. "This is good work," she said. "Important work. Better than what I would have done if you'd stayed invisible." "Thank you," Daniel replied, "and thank you for that night in a strange way. It forced something into the open that had been hidden too long. For both of us, I think." She smiled at that, a genuine smile without the defensive edges it used to carry. "I think we both learned something that night. Maybe that's worth the embarrassment, though I'm still not sure I've forgiven myself for it." "Forgiveness is overrated," Daniel said. "Understanding is better. You understand now that the people around you have full lives, full histories, that existence doesn't begin and end with their service to you. That's more valuable than forgiveness." Years later, when Sophia was in college studying medicine like her mother, but still playing piano for pleasure, she asked her father about that evening, wanting to hear the full story from his perspective. Daniel told her everything, the humiliation and the reversal and the strange aftermath. "The thing people don't understand about those moments," he said, "is that they're not really about talent or skill. They're about seeing and being seen. For years, I'd moved through that house invisible, defined entirely by my function. And then suddenly everyone was looking at me, really looking, and they had to reconcile the person they'd assumed I was with the person I actually am. That kind of recognition is uncomfortable for everyone involved." "But you handled it well," Sophia said. "I handled it honestly. That's different from handling it well." Daniel smiled at his daughter, at this miracle of modern medicine and stubborn survival, at this person who'd reshaped his entire life simply by existing and needing him. "The truth is, I was angry at first. Angry at Victoria for trying to humiliate me. Angry at myself for being in a position where that was possible. But anger doesn't serve much purpose unless it pushes you toward change. So I let it push me. Toward the job, toward reclaiming something I'd thought was finished." "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked. "Giving up your career when I was sick?" "Never," Daniel said. And he meant it with every part of himself. "Music was important, but you were essential. There's no comparison. There was never a choice, really. And the career I have now, the work I do with the program, it matters more than performing ever did. Because I'm helping other people make their own choices, find their own paths, instead of just demonstrating my own skills on a stage." That was the truth of it, Daniel thought, as he watched his daughter process his words. The moment in Victoria's music room hadn't just reversed a humiliation. It had opened a door he'd thought was permanently closed, had shown him that the things you set aside don't disappear, but transform, waiting for you to find them again in new shapes, with new purposes. He'd been a performer once, playing for critics and audiences who measured his worth in technical precision and emotional delivery. Then he'd been a father who cleaned floors to keep his daughter alive, who traded concert halls for hospital corridors without hesitation. And now he was a director of a program that helped other people's children hold on to their dreams, even when circumstances tried to steal them away. Each version of himself had been necessary. Each had been real. The recognition he'd earned that night wasn't really about the applause or the job offer, though those had mattered in practical ways. It was about being seen fully, his past and present, acknowledged as one coherent whole rather than as contradictions. He was all of it. The conservatory student who'd won competitions, the desperate father who'd withdrawn from Warsaw, the invisible janitor who'd listened to music he couldn't play, The passionate musician who'd made Rachmaninoff breathe in a room full of strangers, the patient administrator who helped kids navigate the same impossible choices he'd once faced. None of those identities erased the others. They existed together, layered like the voices in a fugue, each distinct but contributing to a larger harmony he was still learning to hear. Sometimes dignity is about demanding respect in the moment. Sometimes it's about surviving long enough to show people who you really are, in your own time, on your own terms. Daniel had done both. He'd survived the years when survival was the only victory that mattered. And then, when the moment came, he'd shown them exactly who he'd been all along. That night at Victoria's birthday, when he'd sat at that piano with cleaning solution still on his hands and judgment in every eye watching him, he'd played for himself, not for them, not to prove anything or win anything or change anything. He'd played because it was the only honest response to what she'd asked of him, the only way to honor both the person he'd been and the person he'd become. The fact that it had changed everything anyway, that it had opened doors and shifted perceptions and created opportunities he hadn't been seeking, was almost beside the point. The real victory had been in the playing itself, in reclaiming that part of himself not out of bitterness or regret, but out of simple truth. He thought about that sometimes when he stood before an auditorium full of kids and parents, introducing another young musician who'd overcome circumstances that should have made music impossible. He thought about how many talented people moved through the world invisible, their gifts hidden behind uniforms or circumstances, or the simple fact that no one had ever thought to ask who they really were. His job now was to see them, to ask, to create spaces where hidden talents could emerge not through humiliation, but through invitation, not through exposure, but through recognition. Every kid in his program was someone's Daniel, someone with a story that didn't match their circumstances, someone waiting for the moment when they could show the world what they carried inside. And if that moment came with difficulty or discomfort or even embarrassment, well, that was part of it too. Growth rarely happened in comfort. Change rarely came without cost. The important thing was that the moment came at all, that the door opened when it needed to, that the music got played by the people who needed to play it. Sophia had gone quiet, thinking about what he'd said. Finally, she looked up at him. "I'm glad it happened then. Not the humiliation part, but everything after. You seem happier now than I ever remember." Daniel considered that. Was he happier? Maybe. Or maybe he was just more completely himself, no longer dividing his identity between who he'd been and who he'd had to become. The integration felt like peace, even if it hadn't felt like happiness in the moment. "I'm grateful," he said finally, "for all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts maybe, because they taught me things I needed to know, about what matters, about who I am when everything else is stripped away." That was the real lesson of that night, the one that had taken him years to fully understand. Dignity wasn't something that could be given or taken by others. It was something you carried inside, something that survived humiliation and circumstance, and even your own choices to set aside the things you loved. Victoria had tried to take his dignity that night, but she couldn't, because it had never been hers to take. What she'd actually done, without meaning to, was give him an opportunity to reclaim something he'd set aside so carefully that he'd almost forgotten it was still his. The music had always been his. The talent had always been his. The identity of musician had always been his, even when he was emptying trash cans and mopping floors. He just needed a moment, however uncomfortable, to remember that truth and let others see it too. And now, years later, with Sophia healthy and Elena thriving, and his program helping hundreds of kids find their own paths through music, Daniel could look back at that moment without anger or embarrassment, just recognition of what it had cost, of what it had given, of how sometimes the worst moments open doors to the best possibilities if you're brave enough to walk through them. Let me know where you're watching from.